The last policy of Russian Czars in the 19th century we're going to look at is nationalism. This evolved over the course of the 19th century. Peter the Great, at the beginning of the 18th century, end of the 17th century, established a new capital at St. Petersburg. This signaled that the Russian Czars were going to look towards the West. It was a moment of what historians refer to as modernization. Peter the Great brought in artisans from Western Europe. He wanted to learn their technology. He wanted to build a navy. He wanted to build glorious buildings. And what he built was this new capital at St. Petersburg. He had moved the capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg. So, for example, we look at Kazan Cathedral, 1801 to 1811, right? At the height of the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, and Russian Czars are imitating classical Greco-Roman styles. If we then compare that to St. Peter's Basilica from the Renaissance, it looks as if at the beginning of the 19th century, Russian Czars were going to continue to look west, right? So they were rejecting some of the older Russian traditions of iconography, icon paintings, where these, particularly Mary and Child, this is Our Lady of Vladimir, one of the oldest icons venerated in the Russian Empire. These icons had power. People who used these icons for prayer got spiritual blessings, got earthly blessings from God. On the right is St. Basil's in Moscow. It is a traditional Russian Orthodox building with its distinct onion domes in multiple colors. It is not following, or it did not even try to follow the Greco-Roman styles you see in the West and coming out of the Renaissance. The Russian Empire did not have a Renaissance, did not have a Reformation. And so at the beginning of the 19th century, when Russian leaders are trying to copy Western styles, there still was this belief that what was going on in the West was a sign of strength. But that changed at the beginning of the 19th century when Napoleon invaded. That caused a backlash against the West. And so Russian leaders set about censorship, using official channels to shut down the flow of information from Western Europe into the empire. One of the prime examples of this is Prince Alexander Golitsyn. He was the Minister of Education. He took this post because he was head of the Russian Bible Society. And so for Golitsyn, education meant Bible studies, because Bible studies meant submission to God. Submission to God meant following the emperor. So when Golitsyn is looking at what's happening in France, what's happening in Western Europe, he blamed it on people like Immanuel Kant. Kant was praising the Enlightenment, the 18th century Enlightenment. Kant defined the Enlightenment as man's leaving his self-caused immaturity. Immaturity is the incapacity to use one's intelligence without the guidance of another. Such immaturity is self-caused if it's not caused by a lack of intelligence, but by a lack of determination and courage to use one's intelligence without being guided by another. Traditional European society said you need to be guided by a priest or a pope or a preacher. Traditional European society said you need to be guided by your king or your monarch. Traditional European society said you needed to be guided by a father figure, a patriarch. Russia shared in that traditional outlook. The Enlightenment helped spur the French Revolution, because the Enlightenment says you don't have to obey, you can dissent. You don't have to follow, you can lead. That type of using one's intelligence without being guided by a king or a preacher or a dad, right, led to an upheaval in the West that started a move towards popular participation. We've already seen what happened in France. We've already seen what happened in England. Russia was watching this. And so Golitsyn looks at that and said, the way to stop the turmoil is to stop the ideas. Because in the Bible, the troubles in the world started when Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. If people don't learn evil thoughts, the world's going to be a better place. And so the job as his minister of education required him to teach the Bible. And for him, that meant Orthodox Russian teachings, and to make that uniform throughout. This created a promotion of the Russian language, Russian Bible reading in Russian, and that included in Protestant areas as well as Catholic areas, because he was going to promote the reading of the Bible in Russian, and the Bible will then teach the values of submission and obedience and patriarchy. Now we have to put this into context of how far this is going to reach as Minister of Education. There were only 48 high schools with a total of 5,000 students. Remember, the population is anywhere from 40 million to 60 million people over the course of this time period, with 48 high schools and 5,000 students. By and large, Russia had one of the most illiterate populations, because literacy was once again a sign of the devil, and it had to be controlled, and you had to have the proper training in order to know what knowledge, because knowledge was great danger. There were only 337 primary schools. All of these were basically divinity schools, where kids were brought in, boys were brought in to learn the basics of Bible reading, so that they could then advance up either in service to the state or service to the church, which was one and the same, right? Because Russia defined its nationalism, right, its identity, as an Orthodox community distinct from Western Europe. Right? They weren't Catholics, they weren't Protestants. Their heritage, their founding as a culture went back to Saint Vladimir, and that's why they were distinct. And they were very proud of the fact that they did not share in the Renaissance, they did not share in the Reformation. They had their heritage directly handed down from the Byzantine Empire, traced back to the beginnings of Christianity. They were going to keep out all of the nasty secular ideas coming out of the Enlightenment. So to conclude then, right, in the 19th century, Russia was a traditional society. It was elitist and patriarchal. Right? Only a distinct few participated in politics. The Czar was an emperor. He decided who he was listened to. He decided who he was going to keep far away. The authority his personal authority passed down from father to son. This was not based on popular participation. It was not based on any type of suffrage. There were no elections. God appointed the leaders of Russia. The Russian Empire remained overwhelmingly rural and agrarian. Unlike Western Europe, there was no sort of mercantile or mercantilist philosophy trying to push the development of foreign trade. Russian czars continued to promote serfdom, in which peasants were tied to the land, bound to the land. This worked because they had wheat fields in the southern regions that were able to feed and support this population. But there was no real industrial revolution in the early 19th century. There was no, in the early 19th century, no promotion of steamboats or railroads. Russia remained a backward-looking economy. Russia was a society of orders that the czar, the nobles, the churchmen, clergy, all had distinct roles as an elite in society, and they governed over all the rest of the commoners. There was no real social mobility for people to have an opportunity to climb that social ladder. The birth determined a person's place in society. Russia remained a traditional society well through the 19th century. Russia remained a traditional society well through the 19th century. The Russian Empire was a multi-ethnic empire governed by the Rus. And in particular, one family governed it, the Romanov dynasty. The Romanov dynasty looked towards Western Europe. They saw the erosion of traditional society by popular ideas coming out of the Enlightenment, and the Romanov dynasty made a conscious choice to avoid modernity. They did not want urbanization. They did not want equalization. They did not want fraternization. They were placed on the throne by God, and God wanted order.